But today we wanted to take a look at an interesting stat. And it's an interesting stat, I think, because it's a very Transfermarkt stat. And one that most people listening to different football podcasts wouldn't really have heard of. And that is the concept of how each club in Europe's top 5 leagues have done in the league table compared to where they rank in their league by the overall market value squad, the overall squad value of their combined players. So I'm not sure if I made that clear, but as we'll get into it, hopefully people will understand. So
it's quite simple. There's a market value ranking, and then there is the actual table, right? And it's like we compare the two.
Yeah, and so if your league position is higher than your market value ranking, you have a positive score. But if it's lower, you have a negative score. And on this week's show, we want to discuss the clubs that have the worst scores in Europe's top 5 leagues. And we'll throw it up on the screen now for people who are obviously watching this video. But if you're listening to this in your car, don't worry, or out your jog, we'll break it down. We'll start at the bottom, Manu, on -5. On the ranking, we have 3 clubs. We have Monaco, we have Werder Bremen, and we have Nantes, the League On side. 3 really interesting clubs there. 2, well, maybe one big club and one maybe surprising club. Monaco, of course, former Ligue 1 champions, but maybe Werder Bremen are perhaps the most interesting one from your point of view because, you know, a club who sacked their manager or head coach, as he'd been known in the Bundesliga. He went to RB Leipzig. They thought they made the right decision, but actually, you know, Ole Werner at RB Leipzig now, 3rd place, things looking pretty rosy there, but things for Werder Bremen not doing so well in comparison.
Yeah, I mean, Werder Bremen is interesting, right? They sacked their head coach after the head coach refused to sign a new contract, right? So because every time I mention it that way, someone's like, well, he wanted to leave anyways. It's like, yes, that's true, but then you still sacked him. Yeah, I think, you know, he went on to RB Leipzig and got them back into Champions League football in very convincing fashion, which speaks for him, I think, you know, and one of the things that he was always accused of, that he wasn't able to work with young players. Well, there's a certain Jan Diomande who will disagree with that. If you haven't heard of Jan Diomande, you've been living under a rock. Ole Werner has done a fantastic job with him. And Werder Bremen brought in a coach in Horst Steffen, from Elversberg, who was known to develop young players, and they didn't give him the time to actually develop these young players, fired him, and then gave the job to Marcel Tione to rescue the day. I think the only good news for Werder Bremen this season is that they weren't relegated, which is not something that Nantes can say, for example, right? A big traditional club in France who has been relegated. That's already said. But yeah, I mean, you know, there were certain expectations that came in with Werder Bremen. I know you spoke with their one of the CEOs ahead of the season, Klaus Filbri, I think it was, right? Who said they were willing to take a step back to eventually take 2 steps forward. I guess they can say that is still the case because they weren't relegated, but I would make the argument they weren't relegated because there were simply 3 teams that had no clue what they were doing this year. So the only reason they weren't, and we get to talk about one of those teams, I think later in the show, but, you know, it's really not because Werder Bremen did a good job of not getting relegated. It's really because they were literally 3 teams that were completely inept in the Bundesliga. Is the only reason they're still in it.
Yeah, interesting that they are technically, by this metric, the 2nd worst performing team in the Bundesliga. So, yeah, maybe Ole Werner made the right choice there. 3 clubs above them, well, technically above them on the table, below them in terms of score, and that's Fiorentina, Newcastle, and Chelsea, all on -6. Fiorentina, Manu, if I'm not mistaken, only very recently confirmed that they won't be getting relegated from Serie A. Huge story in Italy. But
could have been way worse for them this year, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think also, but, you know, people probably look at that list and think, wow, Chelsea and Newcastle there, which makes a lot of sense, I guess. You know, Newcastle obviously sitting 13th in the league table, Chelsea sitting 9th. I think I was noting to one of our colleagues last weekend that there's actually a good chance that Chelsea could finish the season in the bottom half of the table, which is crazy because obviously by the sheer fact that they've signed so many players, but also spent a lot of money, they also have one of the most valuable squads in the world, but are just simply struggling to compete in the Premier League this season. numerous head coaches coming and going. There's big talk about Xabi Alonso. I was going to say Xavi Simons there, not quite. Maybe he'll be just as useful, I'm not quite sure. But yeah, Xabi Alonso potentially getting the job there, which I'm a little pessimistic about, to be honest with you. I'm not quite sure I believe that one just yet. But crazier things have happened, Manu. But yeah, 3 big clubs there, 3 big European clubs that have clearly struggled this season.
I think Newcastle is really fascinating to me too. I suspect what happened there is that maybe playing in the Champions League was a little bit too much to chew off for them. And you could really tell that in the group stage they did all right, but the moment they played against bigger teams from Europe's elite leagues or elite clubs, they really struggled. And then I think the whole Alexander Isak transfer saga in the summer really hurt them. And then, of course, now you have the whole thing with Anthony Gordon potentially wanting to leave the club. He's been heavily linked to Bayern Munich. I think that is a story that has legs. It really comes down to what Bayern Munich want to do at this point. But, I think they're really fascinating to me because they have definitely made a step back in their development. But I do hope that doesn't lead to Howe being sacked, because I think he's a fantastic coach. And I think this is literally a case of, they made a step back, but it is because of all the noise surrounding the club.
Yeah, I think with Newcastle, people assume, okay, they've got a lot of money, they don't have any issues, but because they have to kind of dance to that PSR tune, excuse me, they've had to be very specific about the signings they make. And I think they've been quite lucky, if you want to say, or maybe they've done their due diligence, fair enough, in the last kind of couple of years where most of the signings have paid off very well. But I think the signings they made this year just simply haven't worked out. They kind of were very kind of caught off guard by Isaac leaving. They panic bought in the transfer window, and it just hasn't really kind of worked out for them. And I completely agree with you. I do kind of hope House stays there and he can kind of wrestle control that squad again in the summer, and maybe they can bounce back, because they're certainly not the 13th worst team in the Premier League, despite what the league table would suggest. But we move on. Just above them in the table, 3 clubs again on -7. So that means their league position is 7 levels below where they rank in their respective leagues in terms of their squad market value. And that is Nice, Girona, and Nottingham Forest. Nottingham Forest, an obvious one, Manu. They spent a huge amount of money. They have a big squad, a lot of very valuable players. We had Ben on the show not so long ago talking about Elliot Anderson, for example. So we maybe don't have to go too much detail into Nottingham Forest, but I'm quite intrigued by the other 2 clubs. Nice, potentially, still in the running for relegation, but Girona, a club who were 3rd in La Liga 2 seasons ago. Obviously quite famously won promotion from the 2nd division, considered this very smartly run club. They have obviously ties to Manchester City and even directly to Pep Guardiola, actually. They've got a number of Man City players on loan, but things have just completely fallen apart. And I think that might be a good story to have Ivan Fuente, our Spanish football expert, on the show soon to discuss.
Yeah, I really think so too. A deep dive on Girona, I think, is something that's really important. I suspect, I'm not the expert on Spanish football, but what I do know about Girona and what I know about writing the market value text for La Liga is that there is a significant amount of turnover, because they are kind of like, they are for Man City what Strasbourg is for Chelsea, right? There's a lot of players that go there. There's also sometimes players like Tati Castellanos comes to mind, who did really well at New York City FC, and rather being sent to Man City, they get to send to Girona to like increase their market value and then be sold on to make money for the City Group, right? So you have a lot of that. And then they were in the Champions League 2 years ago as well, and I think that was also a step too far for them, right? And this is also true for a club like Chelsea. Like the squad turnover, if you have too much of it, you can't build consistency. It just doesn't work.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, 2nd place is a club on its own, and that's, of course, Wolfsburg, who, Manu, I'm sure you could spend half an hour talking about, but they sit on a score of -8. And going into the final match day in the Bundesliga this season, this weekend, could absolutely get relegated. In fact, they'll either get relegated or they'll end up in the relegation playoff spot. So either way, they'll be fighting for their future, either the playoff spot or confirmed as a second-tier club. And as if that isn't confusing in itself, they also decided to change their logo this weekend just to confuse anyone who hasn't been paying attention.
They brought back the old logos from the 1990s when they were still playing in the Zweite Bundesliga, which is maybe a come full circle moment for them if things go badly it will be the next 2 weeks, right? Because even if they are going to finish 16th, which they have in their own hand, all they need, quote unquote, all they need is a win against St. Pauli. It is somewhat in their own hands. Having said that, if Heidenheim in the parallel game get a big win, then they're still in trouble. It's complicated. Look at the table. It's very tight. But what I've got to say is this: Wolfsburg, one of the highest salaries in German football, one of the highest squad values in German football, lots of turnover, lots of inconsistency, different coaches. It's a place that players only come to really use as a stepping stone, because it's not one of the big cities in Germany, right? The joke is in Germany that the best thing about Wolfsburg is the 45-minute train ride to Berlin. It is not one of those big traditional clubs cemented in German football, significantly financed by Volkswagen, a company that's also in trouble. So maybe all of this is a result of that. And yeah, there's a really realistic scenario that over the next 2 weeks, including the relegation playoffs, they could be relegated.
Yeah, which would be perhaps the biggest story in European football in terms of biggest drops, falls from grace. Former Bundesliga title winners getting relegated with, as you said, one of the biggest budgets in the league. If not for the club that are top of this list, then that, to no surprise to anyone who's been following football this season, is of course Tottenham Hotspur, who have a score or a ranking or whatever you want to call this of -12. So their league position in the league table in the Premier League, which is of course currently 17th, is 12 points below where they are in the Premier League in terms of their squad market value, which would obviously put them 5th in the English top flight. And I don't even know where to go with Tottenham, Manu. I'm sure we'll do a big debrief on it when the season ends, but there is huge there's turmoil on and off the pitch at that club. There's a lot to go on that you can't really discuss within 2 or 3 minutes. My personal opinion is that they've spent a lot of money on some very average players. They've made some panic buys. Xavi Simons, a perfect example of that this season. Some good players in there, don't get me wrong. Mickey van de Ven, for example, I think is a potentially world-class central defender. But it's a squad, I think, that's maybe not been as good as it had been billed, if you want. And we've seen the market value of a number of their key players drop dramatically this season. And this is now a third head coach in 12, 18 months that hasn't been able to get a song out of this team in terms of where they should be in the league table. And worryingly for Tottenham, Manu, they've got 2 games left to win, or to kind of avoid relegation, because it's basically going to come down between them and West Ham. Tottenham have to go away to Chelsea, and then they have a final match day at home to Everton, who've been very good this season. And West Ham go away to Newcastle, which will be difficult, but then play at home to Leeds. And for anyone who's not been keeping tabs on the Premier League, there's only 2 points between them. So if both teams lose this weekend, it could come down to that final match day where West Ham play at home to Leeds and then Tottenham play at home to Everton. And I would maybe put my money on West Ham at that point. So there's a very, very real possibility here that Tottenham could get relegated. I think it's quite obvious, if I'm not mistaken. I haven't got numbers to hand, but we've definitely done articles on it this season. But they would be, if I'm not mistaken, the most valuable club, most valuable squad to ever get relegated from a top flight, from one of Europe's top 5 leagues. And it's been an unmitigated disaster.
Would that be the biggest relegation, you think, since Newcastle went down?
In Premier League history?
Must be, right?
Yeah, I think so. It's a good question. Trying to think what comes to mind. Yeah,
I mean,
I think
Blackburn
one
was
that
a big
stands out
deal
is, of
at the
course,
time, right?
the one that comes to mind, of course, is Leicester City. Got relegated so soon after winning the league, but they're
Yeah,
not,
true.
they're not a kind of perennial top flight club. I think Tottenham getting relegated would be the biggest relegation in my lifetime from the Premier League for sure. Maybe Leeds back in the 90s, perhaps, but that was due to financial difficulty and things like that. But yeah, biggest disaster story in European football for sure, Manu, and that's why they're top of this table.
Well, I can also say like it's a bad sign when your best player played on loan at a different club.
Yeah, you're of course talking about Vuskovic, who's on loan at Haasfall
You
in
know
the Bundesliga.
that is always a really bad sign. Of course, the hope is now that he comes back and helps this Tottenham team next year. But I can say with some certainty that if Tottenham go down, he'll not come back.
Yeah, well, it's funny you should say that because I actually wrote an article for Transfermarkt last week looking at all the players that are on loan from Tottenham at other clubs, and Vuskovic is a perfect example of that. But there's other ones. There's Langshear, who's doing very, very well at Oxford United in the Championship. There's Phillips, who's doing very well at Stoke City in the Championship. Devine at Preston, Alfie Devine's doing very well, and Mikey Moore, who actually won the Young Player of the Year award in Scotland, who's on loan at Rangers. So there might be some good players coming back to the club this summer for the club to kind of rebuild. But it just depends whether they'll be rebuilding the Premier League or the Championship, I suppose.
Yeah, no, this is definitely a massive story. A massive story. Curious to see how it plays out.